Ready to go.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me? Great. Thank you for having me here this evening. I'm so pleased to be here speaking at the University of Texas Marine Science Institute in Port Aransas. Port Aransas is one of my favorite vacation spots. And I wish I was there with you this evening, but Mother Nature had other plans. So I'm coming to you from the frozen tundra of Austin, Texas. I'm here to bring you the story of Mary Sears and the group of marine scientists who worked with her behind the scenes during World War II. This story is definitely one of those under the radar stories of World War II, and one which captivated me from the very beginning. Mary Sears is a legend in the world of oceanography, not just for her scientific expertise investigating plankton and other marine life forms, not just for the amazing oceanographic intelligence report she prepared for the war, not just for her skillful editing of the very first journal of oceanography, Deep Sea Research. She is a legend because of her entire life. Her life is an oceanographic tapestry imbued with grit, high standards, her saltiness, a dry sense of humor, her compassion and dedication to her community, and maybe just a little bit of Johnny Walker Black Label. I was so impressed by what I learned about Mary Sears that I decided to write a book about her to bring her story to a wider audience. Before I did so, I went down to the local bookstore, Book People. I went to the World War II section of that bookstore. I looked down the shelves to the books about the Pacific Campaign. They had a specific section for that. Books with the words tides and oceans. Those big, thick books where I was sure I would find something about Mary Sears. I would flip back to the index. First, I would check to see if her name was in the index, and it never was, not in a single book. Then I would look for the word oceanography. Never found it, not in a single book. That told me not only was Mary Sears' story untold, but also the entire story of naval oceanography and how it helped the United States Navy and the Marine Corps pull off one daring amphibious operation after another in the critical Pacific Campaign of World War II. It just wasn't there. Somebody needed to write it. Luckily for me, I did it. Our story begins on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, killing or injuring 3,500 servicemen, damaging or destroying 19 Navy ships, including 8 battleships, and putting 180 aircraft out of commission. The attack was not the fatal blow that the Japanese intended, but it did cripple our naval and air strength in the Pacific, and it left Hawaii and the west coast of the United States vulnerable to attack. In fact, people prepared on the west coast for attacks. It was a frightening time for our national defense. The Japanese had forced us to act, to declare war before we were ready. But our ability to fight had been severely weakened. As President Roosevelt confided to his wife, Eleanor, he really didn't know how the Navy would go about fighting across 2 oceans with such a severe shortage of ships and an impaired Navy. He could only hope to stave off disaster while waiting for American shipbuilders to produce more. The attack on Pearl Harbor thrust the United States into a 2-ocean war of global proportions. We had already been heavily involved in defending the Atlantic Ocean, the site of numerous attacks by German submarines on American and British shipping. After Pearl Harbor, we had a new ocean to defend, the largest ocean on Earth, 64 million square miles of sea. Think about defending that. We were looking at going to war in the largest ocean on Earth for the first time, and we didn't even know anything about it. Unlike World War I, the ocean would play a major role in World War II. In World War I, shown here on the left, American troops sailed across the Atlantic, docked in friendly harbors, and made their way to the European front. In World War II, however, shown here on the right, no one would be rolling out the welcome mat for our troops, especially in the Pacific, where every battle to capture a strategic target would be met by fierce opposition at the shore. On December 7th, 1941, when World War II kicked off, Mary Sears, the marine biologist who would become the first full-time oceanographer of the Navy, was sailing on a trawler off the coast of Peru. She had been summoned there by ornithologist William Vogt because the population of the guano birds in Peru was waning. You can see there's quite a few of these guys over here. At that time, guano birds were the source of the finest fertilizer in the world, and the guano crop was the major export of Peru, so it was essential to the economy. Vogt surmised that the birds were starving. They were starving to death. He didn't know why. He thought it had something to do with the anchovies shown here on the left that they fed off of, that perhaps the food source was in danger. And he knew that the anchovies fed off of plankton. So he consulted with the foremost planktonologists in the world. And just as a review, plankton are the small to microscopic organisms that drift in the ocean and serve as a food source to larger marine species. And Mary Sears was one of the foremost plankton experts in the country. How did she get to be that way? At a time when less than 5% of scientists in the United States were women. Well, Mary Sears grew up in Wayland, Massachusetts, about 10 miles west of Boston. She attended Radcliffe. She obtained her undergraduate degree in 1927, and she went on to achieve a doctorate in zoology. While she was at Radcliffe, she happened to meet this man, Henry Bryant Bigelow, and he offered her a position as a research assistant. And Bigelow, at that time, was probably the most accomplished marine biologist, oceanographer in this country. And from the time she met Bigelow as a graduate student, and for the rest of his life, she worked with him. And Bigelow is the person who founded the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in 1930. So the routine became Mary would work with Bigelow up at Harvard or Radcliffe during the winter, and then in the summers, they would go over to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. So it was initially a part-time facility. And of course, the war would change that. It would become full-time. The reason that Mary Sears had taken the job, the opportunity in Peru on the eve of a world war, sailing through dangerous waters, is because it afforded her an opportunity that she did not have in the United States. Women were not allowed on oceanographic expeditions at that time, nor would they be allowed for another 3 decades. Why was this? Well, there were superstitions about women. They dated back to the times of Odysseus. Women were thought to be unlucky, that they would cause misfortune on the high seas. Women would distract the men. People made excuses, lack of separate bathrooms, sleeping quarters, what have you. But Mary Sears had left Woods Hole, traveled through dangerous waters to perform research because she might not get another opportunity in her entire career. When she returned to Woods Hole, she found that the labs had been taken over by naval research. And she watched as the men, one by one, went to join the Navy. And she wanted to go too, but at first she had to wait until the Navy allowed women in, which was July of 1942. That took passing a congressional bill. And initially, women were allowed into the Army, but it took longer with the Navy because the Navy was a macho organization, and they put up stronger resistance to allowing women. But eventually they were allowed. Initial estimates were that about 10,000 waves would be needed. But when the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics requested 20,000, just that one division, the estimates were revised upward to 75,000 enlisted women and 12,000 officers. And the Navy needed every single one of them. As soon as women were permitted to join the Navy, Mary Sears applied to join, but she was rejected. And, I've reviewed her medical records, and it looks like she had an infected joint in one of her fingers, and this got labeled arthritis. And even though it had totally resolved, the Navy rejected her because of this history of arthritis. And Mary Sears might have sat on the sidelines for the entire war. But after she was rejected, a naval lieutenant, Roger Revell, a marine geologist who had been assigned to the Hydrographic office part-time, came to Woods Hole. He was looking for a substitute because he thought the job at the Hydrographic office would be dull, and he wanted someone to take his place. The only one that the director of Woods Hole would part with, the only oceanographer he would part with, was the only woman on staff, Mary Sears. He said, "You can have her." Sears was still anxious to serve, so she applied again, obtained a medical waiver, and after completing officers training at Mount Holyoke, she finally reported to the Navy's Hydrographic office in April 1943. Think about that date for a minute. We had been fighting World War II for a year and a half before Mary Sears was able to take her place as the first full-time oceanographer in the Navy. The burden of the two-ocean war would fall particularly hard on the Naval Hydrographic Office, which was initially the office that provided maps and navigation aids for the Navy and for all the merchant ships. Well, as the war got underway, even before it got underway, this man, Rear Admiral George S. Bryan, he knew, he could see what was coming. He could see we're going to have to do a lot because we're going to be expected to be issuing maps for all these areas we've never been. And not only that, we're going to lose access to foreign nautical charts. And when he went to work there in 1938, he inherited a terrible situation. There'd been no increase in personnel for a number of years. Their machinery was outdated, their equipment, they were badly cramped for space. Other than that, it was a great job. I read the history of the Hydrographic Office during World War II. And this quote stood out to me. "The establishment of theaters of war all over the globe led to an unprecedented demand for charts." That's the maps of the sea, the description of coasts, port facilities, navigational aids, and for the issuance of sailing directions, air pilots, and other publications not previously covered. So all of a sudden, this small agency in Washington, D.C., which was pivotal to the two-ocean war, was just under siege. And that is where Mary Sears went to work. Here's some of the people that joined her there. She recruited a few other marine biologists to help her in her mission to provide oceanographic information. Finner Chase, you can tell he was cut out for the job. He was a hermit crab expert at Harvard. And Mary was able to wrangle him into coming to join her because he was going to be drafted anyway. She also was very fortunate to get Dora Henry, who was known as the Barnacle Lady at the University of Washington, because she knew everything about barnacles, and she had even cataloged barnacles for the author John Steinbeck. And then they managed to snag the country's really most expert oceanographic librarian, a woman named Mary Greer. And what happened, the University of Washington had oceanographic laboratories, but they closed at the outset of the war. And Mary Greer had gone to work in a Boeing plant where she was doing quality control. So imagine how excited she was to get a phone call, asking her to come to Washington and start doing the kind of work she was trained to do. She wasted no time in hopping on a bus and telling her parents goodbye. I'll see you later. Mary Sears also worked at the hydrographic office with people she called the enlisted girls. 350 waves were working there at the hydrographic office, helping prepare these essential maps and doing every part of map making that was required. One of the more interesting projects that Mary Sears worked on was one of the very first ones. Eddie Rickenbacker, who had been a World War I ace pilot, during World War II, he was asked to serve as kind of a reviewer of some of the Air Force bases and so forth that were coming online in the Pacific Ocean. Unfortunately, his plane went down in October 1942. He wasn't flying it. Somebody else was piloting it, and there was a whole group of people going out to this air base and Canton Island, but they got lost and they ran out of gas and they had to ditch their plane and get into a raft. And it took a really long time. I think it was 21 days to find Rickenbacker and his crew in the Pacific Ocean. And afterward, there was a lot of excitement about, well, why did it take so long? Because we knew exactly where he was going down, but we never found him. And they asked Mary Sears to compile some information on objects drifting at sea, which she did. She went back and she created a manual. And this manual was used the rest of the war to help pinpoint the direction of wreckage and where you could find people and which way were people likely to float if they were in rafts. So that was really essential. And then she and Fenner Chase worked on these cloth rescue maps for downed pilots. These were maps made out of sort of a rayon silk hybrid that the pilots could carry, stuff either in the pocket of their flight jacket or wear around like a scarf around their neck. And these had currents, and they were drawn in depending on the direction and how strong they were, the heaviness of the line. And these were revolutionary. I mean, we have so much technology at our disposal now. We take something like this for granted, but this was a revolutionary design. And the data that these maps contained helped save at least 100 pilots. It's hard to know exactly how many, but that was the number that I was able to come up with. The other thing that they worked on was this Bathythermograph instrument and the data that it produced. And this was a very primitive instrument at the time. It was just being, it wasn't invented at Woods Hole, but it was being refined so it would be more reliable during the war. And what this thing did, and it's like about 2 feet long, and it's a very heavy thing, like 40 to 60 pounds, and someone has to deploy it to get measurements. And it measures temperature versus depth in the ocean. And that was very important for identifying thermoclines, layers of the ocean where the temperature changes. And that was essential for submarine warfare because it was the thermoclines where our submarines could hide from enemy ships. So this was all remarkable information that Mary Sears used the data and got it out to the skippers that needed it for their submarines. One of the most important assignments Mary Sears was handed was to compile the Oceanography chapter for something called the Joint Army-Navy Intelligence Studies. And these were intended to be reports that could describe all the characteristics of a strategic area, every detail that could affect a combat operation by land, sea, or air. So it had information about geography, demography, social economic characteristics of a given area that was going to be invaded. But Sears and her group in the Oceanographic unit compiled Chapter 13, which included things like tides, waves, currents, correlating the tides with the time of day, which was important for choosing your landing time, salinity, bottom sediments, acoustic conditions, and biological factors like seaweed and bioluminescence. All of this played a very big role in predicting the success or the approach of an amphibious landing during the war. And I don't know how much you know about the Pacific Campaign, but it was predicated on one amphibious landing after another on hostile islands across the Pacific. So you can see how knowing a little bit about the oceanography of a particular island you were going to invade would be important to the success of the mission. The JANIS program was still in its infancy and suffering through some growing pains when the amphibious campaign got underway. Consequently, Sears and her group were not able to provide data for Tarawa, which was a very important, probably one of the first major amphibious missions. It took place on November 20th, 1943. And the problem with Tarawa, they wanted to invade this island. And Tarawa was an atoll. It was a little sequence of islands here, surrounded by coral reef. And the question on the eve of the invasion was, would tidal levels be high enough for the landing boats to cross the reef? And the Higgins boats, which were the landing boats that had been designed for these missions, needed a 4-foot draft to get across the reef. Well, they consulted, the only information they had at the time were nautical charts over 100 years old. And they consulted some foreign experts and locals for tidal estimates. And they knew that the tides could be dicey, but they were assured that they would get a minimum of 5 feet of tide. As a backup, they acquired a limited number of first-generation amphibious tractors, what are known as amtracks or LVTs, just in case the outside possibility that they could not get across. Well, what happened on November 20th, 1943? It happened to be one of 2 days in the year when a very low neap tide prevailed. This is when the moon is at its farthest point from Earth and creates a very narrow tidal range. As a result, the mean tidal level stayed around 3.3 feet for about 48 hours. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that that was a total disaster, resulting in the stranding of a large number of boats and men and delaying the arrival of reinforcement that jeopardized the entire operation. So men would motor up to the reef, and then they would have to get out, hold their weapons high, under attack, and try to get to shore. This is an eyewitness account I obtained from the Oral History Archives at the National Museum of the Pacific War from Charles Pace, who was a 17-year-old machine gunner from West Virginia. And he said, we'd watch these lines of Marines climb out of the Higgins boats as they worked up to the reef, and then try to walk ashore. And occasionally we would see a man disappear. Then maybe 2 or 3 men away, another man would disappear, and they would just drop into the water. These men were being picked off by machine guns, all because the tides had been misjudged. So at the Battle of Tarawa, there were high casualties, stranded boats. The amtracks, these tracked vehicles that were supposed to serve as backups, they were not armored. They were not meant to haul men at that point, this first generation. So they were shot up, they exploded. They did not help as much as people thought. There were not enough of them, and they were disabled very quickly. After the Battle of Tarawa, it was a bit of a PR disaster. Admiral Nimitz went to visit Tarawa and had to walk through the corpses and all that sort of thing. And the Senate Naval Affairs Committee met, and it was just, people were afraid this is going to continue all across the Pacific campaign. This and Nimitz's strategy was second guessed, and people wondered whether he should go through with it. But there really was no other way to get across the Pacific. This is Tarawa right here at the beginning. And, we needed to get to Japan was the idea. All these islands were held by the enemy. So, there really was no other way than to go one amphibious campaign at a time, because we didn't have air bases to launch ships. We didn't have aircraft carriers where planes could take off and get far away. The only way was to island hop and build in bases as we went. So after Tarawa, priorities were realigned, as they tend to be when there's a disaster. And Mary Sears and her team were asked to do these JANIS reports for what would be the next and the next and the next and the next target. So they were finally able to produce the kind of intelligence that would, let the troops know something so simple as, well, if you wait until November 22nd instead of November 20th, you'll have plenty of tides. But that had been left out at Tarawa. Now, even with the best oceanographic intelligence from the oceanographers at the hydrographic office, there were still mishaps occasionally. At Iwo Jima, for example, there was rough surf that was not fully appreciated, and a lot of the landing boats splintered. There was soft volcanic sand that jeeps sunk into, and men had to crawl across. But by the time the troops got to Okinawa, which was the last major invasion of the war, there were calm seas on that day, cooperative weather, and a textbook landing. And look at the amtracks now; they're armored, they speed to shore. It was a whole different ball game, and it wasn't just because of the oceanographers' oceanographic intelligence. It was because of experience and better equipment and everything. We finally had figured out how to do amphibious landing, but no doubt that having the best oceanographic intelligence helped these landings. These JANIS studies, these joint Army-Navy intelligence studies, covered some of these areas listed here. A lot of time was spent preparing for the invasion of Japan, which never took place because the atomic bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But all these reports, China, Japan, Korea, places we did not invade, were used to help locate prisoners of war after the war. There were something like 30,000 prisoners of war, and they were sequestered in all these camps in these obscure areas, and we still had to find them. And so they used this information and these other JANIS reports to navigate and predict conditions. When I added up what Mary Sears had done, and this is a list of what I know she did, but I'm also aware that she worked in the intelligence field with a high security clearance. So there may be things she did that I'm not aware of. But she was the leader of the Navy's Oceanographic unit. She served on 2 Joint Chiefs subcommittees. She gathered oceanographic intelligence for war planners, both in the JANIS reports and then in just individual reports. She performed last-minute calculations for Pacific combat targets in the middle of the night. She prepared data for submarine warfare, and she was a liaison with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution throughout the war. After the war, Admiral Nimitz issued a commendation to Mary Sears and said, in your capacity of oceanographer, you were frequently called upon by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to furnish critically valuable information for use in combat operations. Your performance of all these duties was at all times exceptional and beyond the high standard normally expected. So that was a big deal to get that from the head of the Pacific Forces, who later became the head of the Navy. After the war, Sears returned to Woods Hole, where she spent her entire career. She joined the largely all-male staff and served as clerk of the Woods Hole Corporation. She continued to use her skills compiling data to create a collection of over 250,000 index cards. And these were published in a 15-volume oversized edition and became the most comprehensive oceanographic index ever created. She helped organize the field of oceanography by directing the first International Congress on Oceanography held at the United Nations in New York City in 1959. And as I mentioned earlier, she co-edited the first major oceanographic journal, Deep Sea Research. Another legacy of her tenure as head of the Oceanographic unit was the continued presence and growth of naval oceanography. She started this thing as a one-woman operation, sitting at a desk crammed into the Maritime Security Division of the Hydrographic office. And because she was willing to sit there and take whatever challenges came her way, she proved how necessary the new science of oceanography was and how valuable it could be to the armed forces. So I think it is no stretch to state that the Naval Oceanographic Office, situated at the Stennis Space Center in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, today, where there are over 1,000 employees, provide oceanographic information for all branches of the armed forces, is part of her legacy too. And I can assure you, when I visited there, they consider her the mother of naval oceanography, and her portrait is on the wall, and they revere Mary Sears. And unlike in Mary Sears' tenure, today that office is empowered to identify potential global hotspots and to work alongside all branches of the armed forces to characterize a battle space and be sure they're prepared for any contingency the troops might find. In 1999, 2 years after Mary Sears' death, Secretary of the Navy Richard Danzig selected Mary Sears for the honor of having an oceanographic survey ship, the USNS Mary Sears, named after her, citing her work, identifying thermoclines and assisting Marines in escaping enemy detection. But as I said before, because Mary Sears worked in intelligence, we may never really know the extent of her clandestine activities. While I find it somewhat ironic that a woman who was prohibited from sailing on scientific expeditions and initially turned down by the Navy for admission had a naval research ship named after her, she certainly deserved the honor. And I can only imagine if she had lived to see the USNS Mary Sears, she would have been both proud and amused. This is my book about Mary Sears. This is my email if you want to send me any thoughts. Signed books are available here in Austin, and I can connect you to the bookstore that will send you a copy. And I just want to thank Adriana Riza and the University of Texas Maritime Institute, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.